What I'm about to break down is something most women never consciously notice they're doing, and something most men don't even realize is happening to them. But once you see how this process actually works, your entire understanding of attraction shifts. Men don't usually choose to fall for someone in a clear, deliberate moment. It's not a decision they sit down and make. There's no point where they think they are going to emotionally bond with one person. Instead, it happens quietly, almost underneath their awareness. It builds slowly in the background until one day they suddenly feel attached. And by then, they're already deeper in than they intended to be. That's why attraction is rarely as simple as it looks from the outside. Men don't get emotionally hooked in a straight, obvious line. It doesn't start with a conscious choice or a strong emotional declaration. It starts subtly through repeated exposure, interaction, and unconscious engagement. The process is gradual, almost invisible in real time. A man might think he's just talking, just enjoying the moment, just passing time, without realizing that something deeper is forming underneath. By the time he recognizes there's emotional involvement, the attachment has already taken shape. This is also why many situations feel confusing from the outside, because nothing dramatic has to happen for a strong bond to form. It develops quietly through consistency rather than intensity. One of the biggest misunderstandings is assuming that frequent attention automatically equals emotional attachment. A man can show interest for many different reasons, and most of them are surface level. He might be attracted to appearance, entertained by conversation, reacting to a moment, or simply engaging out of boredom. None of that automatically means emotional depth. Interest is easy and temporary. It can appear quickly and disappear just as fast. Where confusion happens is when that surface level attention is mistaken for something deeper. Real attachment doesn't come from isolated moments of excitement. It forms when interaction turns into repetition, familiarity, and unconscious expectation over time. The real shift happens when a man starts putting in energy, time, and mental focus without fully realizing it. That's where emotional connection begins to solidify. It's not about a single feeling or a dramatic moment, but about accumulated investment that builds gradually. When someone starts thinking about you consistently, responding regularly, and prioritizing interaction without actively deciding to, attachment starts forming beneath the surface. It's not forced, and it's not always intentional. It develops through behavior patterns that slowly shape emotional dependency. And once that line is crossed, the connection is no longer just casual interest. It becomes something deeper that feels difficult to reverse. The moment a man starts preparing actions for you in his mind before he ever expresses them outwardly, he's already stepping into emotional territory he doesn't fully recognize yet. That's the point where things begin shifting internally, even if nothing looks different on the surface. It doesn't feel like attachment in the beginning. It feels like thinking, planning, imagining, or simply considering you more than usual. But those internal rehearsals are the real starting point, because emotional involvement doesn't always begin with action. It often begins in thought first, long before behavior catches up. Stage 2 is what can be called the curiosity pull, where interest starts forming in a quiet, almost invisible way. It usually begins when a woman says or does something that doesn't fully resolve in his mind. She doesn't over-explain herself, doesn't rush to fill every gap, and doesn't make everything overly predictable. Instead, there's a sense of incompleteness that stays behind. The male mind naturally tries to close open loops, so when something feels slightly unfinished, it keeps returning to it. If her responses are warm but not overly eager, present but not fully predictable, he starts engaging mentally without even realizing it. He begins to wonder what she really thinks, why she responded a certain way, or whether she behaves like this with everyone. At that point, she's already occupying mental space he didn't intentionally offer. This is also where things often go wrong, because many women instinctively try to eliminate that tension too quickly. They over-explain, clarify every detail, or try to make everything perfectly understood. But attraction doesn't deepen in total clarity. It tends to grow in partial understanding, where enough is revealed to stay engaged, but not everything is fully settled. Not confusion or manipulation, just a natural sense of openness that isn't completely resolved. That unfinished space is what keeps attention alive longer than immediate certainty ever could. Stage 3 is emotional familiarity without any sense of possession, and this is where things become more powerful. At this point, he feels emotionally at ease around her. The interaction is no longer about impressing or performing. It becomes natural, relaxed, and unfiltered. He speaks more openly, drops his guard, and engages without overthinking. And slowly, something important happens. He starts linking emotional relief to her presence. It's not excitement that creates attachment here, but the way he feels after the interaction ends. If he feels understood, lighter, calmer, or mentally settled after talking to her, his nervous system begins to categorize her as a source of emotional safety. And that sense of safety is what makes the connection quietly deepen over time. You're not asking for anything. You're not demanding clarity, labels, or immediate emotional commitment. There's no pressure, no chasing, no forcing intimacy into a defined shape. Instead, you simply become a presence that feels steady, calm, and mentally grounding to him. Over time, without any obvious shift, he begins to associate that calm with you, and when that association forms, something subtle changes in how he moves through his day. He doesn't consciously decide to reach out more often. It starts happening on its own. Not because he is actively choosing you in every moment, but because his internal system starts leaning toward what feels familiar and regulating. At stage 4, the shift in effort becomes the real turning point. This is where attachment starts to solidify in a way that is no longer just mental, it begins to show in behavior. A man starts adjusting small parts of his actions around you without realizing the deeper pattern forming underneath. He might think twice about how something will sound before saying it. He begins remembering small details without effort. He might subtly avoid certain choices because he already anticipates your reaction. Plans start to shift in quiet, almost invisible ways. From his perspective, nothing dramatic is happening. It just feels like normal consideration. But psychologically, something important is changing, because now he is investing attention, thought, and adjustment at a deeper level than before. The key detail here is that he doesn't consciously label these changes as effort. It doesn't feel like work to him, which is exactly why it's powerful. When behavior becomes automatic like this, it means the connection has moved from surface-level interest into identity-level relevance. You are no longer just someone he talks to, you become someone he starts factoring into his decisions. And once a man begins factoring a woman into his internal decision-making process without realizing it, emotional attachment is already taking root in a much deeper way than casual interest ever could. This is also why so many men can genuinely believe they are not looking for anything serious and yet still find themselves deeply affected by one specific person later on. Because what pulls them in was never a declared intention. It was the accumulation of small, unconscious investments that built up over time without resistance. Attachment rarely announces itself at the beginning. It reveals itself after the pattern is already in place. Stage 5 is where emotional dependence begins to form without the man having clear awareness of it. At this point, he is not necessarily in love, but his emotional baseline is no longer stable in the same way without interaction. If there is silence, his attention drifts back. His mood may subtly shift. His focus may feel slightly off, but he doesn't interpret it as emotional need. He labels it as routine, habit, or coincidence because the experience doesn't feel dramatic enough to call attachment. Yet that subtle imbalance is exactly what attachment looks like in its early form. This is also where many connections collapse if handled incorrectly. If the dynamic suddenly turns into pressure, demands, or forced emotional definitions, the natural flow of investment breaks. The shift in energy makes him step back and reassess the situation consciously, which interrupts the unconscious process that was building attachment in the first place. The strongest pull is created when investment happens naturally, not when it is pushed or chased. Once awareness replaces flow, the dynamic changes completely. If you step back and look at everything so far, the pattern becomes clearer. Curiosity begins when things are not fully resolved. Attention deepens when interaction feels emotionally regulating, and attachment forms when behavior starts shifting without conscious effort. To summarize the pattern clearly, the progression looks like this. First, curiosity stays slightly unresolved, which keeps attention active instead of letting it settle. Second, emotional safety begins forming naturally through repeated interactions that feel calm, consistent, and easy. Third, thought investment slowly starts building, where he begins thinking about her outside of direct contact without being told to. Fourth, his behavior begins adjusting on its own in subtle ways without him consciously labeling it as effort. And fifth, her presence turns into something habitual, something his mind expects rather than actively chooses. None of this depends on manipulation or playing a role. It's more about restraint, timing, and how emotional space is naturally allowed to develop without being forced into immediate definition. If you're still engaged at this point, it usually means the core idea has already landed, because once you recognize how emotional attachment actually forms in men, It changes how you interpret behavior entirely. What comes next is the part most people misunderstand the most, the exact transition point where attraction stops being casual interest and quietly turns into attachment, even while the man himself still believes nothing serious is happening. This is where emotional involvement crosses a threshold without any obvious signal that it has done so. There is a very specific psychological shift that marks this transition. It doesn't happen during physical intimacy, and it doesn't necessarily happen during meaningful conversations or declared feelings. Instead, it happens when uncertainty and investment exist at the same time. When a man puts in time, attention, or mental energy without having full clarity about where it is going, his mind naturally tries to resolve that discomfort. The easiest way it does that is by increasing the perceived value of what he is investing in. In simple terms, if he is already giving effort, his brain starts to assume it must matter more than he initially thought. This is how attachment quietly begins to form beneath conscious awareness. This is also where certainty can unintentionally reduce emotional intensity. Many people assume that clarity automatically strengthens connection, but in reality, too much predictability can reduce emotional pull. When everything is fully defined and completely secure too early, the mind relaxes, and when the mind relaxes, it stops scanning, questioning, or emotionally engaging at the same depth. Strong attachment tends to form in a space where there is comfort but not full closure, where things feel meaningful but still require continued presence and engagement to fully understand. This is a common mistake in modern relationship advice, where people are encouraged to remove ambiguity quickly, communicate everything instantly, and define the relationship as early as possible. While this creates clarity, it can also remove the psychological tension that naturally keeps emotional investment alive. Emotional bonding doesn't usually come from instant access. It develops when access feels gradually earned through consistent interaction over time, not given all at once without effort or build-up. One of the most revealing stages is what can be called the "I didn't mean to care" moment. This is when a man starts noticing his own reactions before he fully understands them. He checks for messages without thinking about it. He becomes aware of mood changes in response to her presence or absence. He feels slightly off when the connection feels distant, even if nothing explicitly changed. And internally, he begins questioning why it even matters to him in the first place. That question itself is the sign that emotional attachment has already started forming beneath his conscious control. This also highlights an important difference in how connection develops. Physical or sexual interest can create attraction and excitement, but emotional availability is what builds lasting attachment. When someone is open enough to feel safe but not overly accessible in every emotional direction at once, it creates space for bonding to develop gradually. Emotional connection strengthens not just through presence, but through the way that presence is experienced and processed over time. A woman who is emotionally present but not emotionally dependent naturally creates a sense of depth that stands out. It's not about being distant or unavailable, and it's not about shutting emotions down. It's about being grounded in yourself while still being open in the interaction. Men don't form lasting attachment based purely on physical attraction. What actually stays with them is how they experience themselves in a woman's presence, their emotional state during the interaction, and more importantly, how they feel afterward when everything goes quiet again. If being around her allows them to relax, express themselves without judgment, and feel internally steady, that experience carries more weight than appearance alone ever could. This is why emotional restraint holds so much influence in connection. Men tend to form stronger attachment toward women who are not emotionally dependent on them. Not because emotional distance is attractive in itself, but because emotional independence removes pressure from the interaction. When there is no sense of obligation, the man doesn't feel forced into a role or expectation. Instead, he feels like he is choosing the connection freely. And psychologically, choice always creates more desire than pressure ever could. Obligation triggers resistance, while genuine desire feels natural and self-directed. Men typically pull away from what feels like demand, but they lean into what feels like a voluntary emotional pull. At a deeper level, something subtle begins to shift as connection develops. There comes a stage where a man starts to think about a woman, even when she is not physically present. It may show up as small concerns, wondering if she is okay, thinking about how she reacted to something, or hoping she is at peace in her day. This is not a purely logical process. It is an emotional reclassification happening in the background. His mind starts placing her in a category that matters beyond the interaction itself. Once that internal shift happens, emotional attachment doesn't just form, it strengthens quietly over time, without needing constant reinforcement. One of the most misunderstood aspects of attraction is the role of space. Healthy emotional distance does not break connection, it gives it room to breathe. When a woman maintains her own identity, her own focus, and her own emotional stability without revolving entirely around the relationship, it creates moments of absence. And absence is powerful because it introduces reflection. When someone is not constantly available, the mind naturally fills that gap with thought. That reflection is where emotional meaning deepens, because the connection is no longer just experienced, it is processed internally during distance. At the final stage, emotional ownership begins to form, but without any sense of control or pressure. This is where the connection feels fully established. The man feels invested, protective, and emotionally aligned, but still free within himself. That sense of freedom is what allows attachment to deepen instead of collapse under pressure. He is not staying because he is forced or managed into it, but because he has built his own internal emotional investment over time. He has adjusted, adapted, and assigned meaning to the connection through his own experience. And once that happens, the idea of losing it carries real emotional weight. Men don't stay in a connection because everything is perfect or because effort is constantly being pushed. They stay because something has already formed inside them, something built through consistency, emotional comfort, subtle uncertainty, and their own repeated investment. By the time they consciously recognize the depth of what they feel, they are already emotionally involved far more than they intended to be at the beginning. The final truth is simple. Attachment is rarely created through grand actions or dramatic moments. It develops through repetition, emotional ease, personal investment, and time. And once you understand that, you start seeing attraction not as something random, but as something that gradually builds itself through experience long before it is ever named. What most people miss is that attraction and attachment don't follow a straight line. They move in cycles. A man can feel interest, pull back, come forward again, and still be building attachment the entire time without realizing it. The key factor isn't intensity, it's continuity. If the emotional experience with a woman stays consistent enough over time, his mind starts treating her presence as part of his internal baseline rather than something optional. That's when she stops feeling like an interaction and starts feeling like a presence in his life, even when she isn't there. Another layer that matters is emotional contrast. If every interaction feels identical, the mind stops paying attention. But when there is a mix of comfort, light unpredictability, and emotional ease, the brain stays engaged because it cannot fully categorize the experience. This doesn't mean chaos or inconsistency in behavior, but rather that the emotional tone is not flat. Humans naturally pay more attention to what feels slightly dynamic because it signals relevance. That is one of the reasons certain connections linger in memory while others fade quickly, even if the time spent was similar. There is also a difference between being understood and being managed emotionally. Men tend to attach more deeply when they feel they can be themselves without constantly performing or defending their identity. If a connection allows them to relax their internal guard, they begin to associate that space with relief. And relief is one of the strongest emotional anchors in human psychology. People often assume attraction is driven by excitement, but long-term attachment is far more connected to emotional regulation than excitement alone.